This is a film about school corridors and the people who try to influence the way children walk down them, or up them, depending on where they want to go. It is a story that starts at the turn of the 20th century, after the Education Reform Act of 1902. Before then, schools did not have corridors. Instead, children attended their lessons by crawling down the class chimney. But that all changed because the man who had drafted the Reform Act, A.J. Balfour, wanted to remove this top-down approach to education. He believed that education should be a level playing field. So schools all over England blocked up their vertical chimneys and began constructing a network of interconnecting horizontal tubes for the children to move through. And, for a while, the children moved silently through these passageways, and the teachers felt in control. In 1971, during a visit to China by the American national ping pong team, American behavioural theorist Carlson observed the Chinese ping pong team walking silently from their changing rooms up to the ping pong table, whereupon they swiftly defeated the American team. Carlson had been a key advocate of applied behaviour analysis in the late 1960s, and he believed that it was their adherence to order and silence that had given the Chinese ping pong team their advantage. Once back in America, Carlson set about working in schools to change the way that American students behaved during transition periods, particularly on the way to ping pong practice. Carlson encouraged students to behave in unruly ways in corridors, shouting at one another, giving other students wedgies, and sticking funny notes on the backs of nerds. This, said Carlson, would build up a superficial level of anti-behaviour that would disorientate people who had grown up in a calm and ordered learning environment. This anti-behaviour could be used to diminish the performance of others, as long as those demonstrating the anti-behaviour remained dedicated to their learning in class. To his surprise, Carlson was wrong, and the American ping pong team who visited China the following year lost every single game. Carlson returned to America disheartened, but to his surprise, the practice of anti-behaviour in corridors did not disappear. In fact, it spread like wildfire across America. What I hadn't properly considered, Carlson said later on, was just how much kids enjoyed messing about in corridors. Back in Britain, and the talking in school corridors had reached a crisis point. What had started as general chats about homework and playtimes had escalated into jokes about geography teachers and a general debasing of the school's behaviour policy. Things had also got worse as a result of the increasing popularity of VHS. Up until then, the Americanism of anti-behaviour in school corridors had, for British school children, been a myth, something that had only been talked about in hushed whispers behind the bike sheds. But now, children could rent films from their local video store and see American anti-behaviour for themselves in popular American films such as The Detention Club, Philip Bueller Has a Day Off School, and Odd Science. In 1991, the Education Secretary Ken Clarke commissioned a report known as the Three Wise Monkeys Report to suggest changes to the way school corridors operated. The report made clear that whilst walking through corridors, children should hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil. It suggested a return to traditional corridor values and an end to the walk and squawk approach that had dominated schools since the early 80s. But the Education Secretary did not share this report with teachers. Instead, he leaked it to the press and invented Ofsted. Back in America, and Carlson was noticing something extraordinary happening in schools and colleges. Many students were being failed by an education system rooted in corridor anti-behaviour, and many of these educational rejects, unable to hold down gainful employment elsewhere, were becoming teachers. Carlson believed that this new wave of teachers may hold the key to transforming corridor behaviour, and he quickly began developing a new behavioural management theory. He called it pro-antivirus. Carlson encouraged teachers to swear in front of their students, to talk derogatively about the school principal, to take up smoking in class, and to turn up for work still drunk from the night before. This pro-anti behaviour, said Carlson, would disorientate the students to such an extent that they would stop anti-behaving in the corridors in a bid to get to class quickly to find out what state their teacher was in that day. Carlson believed that this would, over time, have a permanent change on corridor behaviour, causing their students to re-engage with their learning. But Carlson was wrong. Instead, a strange thing happened. The students continued anti-behaving in the corridors and stopped going to class altogether. But what was even stranger was that nobody cared, because the students could find out everything they needed to learn from YouTube, and the teachers were all too drunk to notice that nobody was turning up to class. Back in Britain, and schools were no longer living in fear of how children were behaving in corridors. They were living in fear of Ofsted instead. And in this climate of fear, an extraordinary thing started to happen. A group of educationalists rose up and started to influence school leaders and their policies. These educationalists were known as consultants. The consultants knew that schools could not keep up with all of the many changes that were being thrown at them by Ofsted and central government. So they told the schools they didn't have to worry. All they had to do was listen to them and do what they told them, and everything would be okay. But what nobody realised was that the consultants didn't know what they were talking about either. But that didn't matter, as they mostly talked about corridors. Because nobody really knew if corridor behaviour really mattered, but everybody thought that it might. And what the consultants soon discovered is that if you kept schools talking about corridors, then Ofsted would keep reporting on corridor behaviour. And if Ofsted kept reporting on corridor behaviour, then schools would continue to pay for consultants to talk to them about corridors, and nobody would end up getting anywhere. Which is, as Carlson once said, pretty ironic when you stop and think about it.